Now, the second part of this talk is really to think, if all of these colonies were subject to the same policies or very similar policies, why didn't they all rebel? Certainly, many of the American patriots thought that they were fighting a cause for the whole world, and certainly the entire English-speaking world and the rest of the British Empire. They expected the other colonies to rise in their favor. There have been lots of monographs on the different colonies, but they've not been brought together in a single picture. Canada is the most interesting because Canada was the place where Americans most expected support. And indeed, they made overtures to Canada through the Committee of Correspondence in Boston. The Massachusetts Congress offered Canada, and specifically Quebec, to join the American Revolution. One of those invitations was written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. And of course, it was the one part of the British Empire which the Americans actually invaded in 1775. But they never really found the support. They essentially made the same error that the British made in America. They assumed that the majority of the population were on their side, and indeed some were, but the majority were either neutral or, in fact, loyal. The one colony that really did support the American Revolution was Bermuda. And that's partly because most of Bermuda's trade had been with America. They were very much involved in shipwrecking, privateers, and fishing. There were families like the St. John family who dominated Bermuda, but happened also to be a prominent Virginia family, so there were the connections of blood. And Bermuda was the only colony in 1775 to send delegates to the Continental Congress. They weren't actually sitting members. They went over as a kind of delegation. And what they were trying to do was to persuade the Continental Congress to regard them as neutrals. In actual fact, though, they were far from neutral. To show that secretly they were supportive of the American cause, they sent gunpowder over, captured from the British fortification there, over to Boston. And for most of the war, they showed a clear preference for the American cause. But the two colonies that are most interesting, and which really bring me back to my original intention and what I was thinking about doing at first, were Ireland and the British West Indies, because these colonies were the ones that were most analogous to the American colonies. They're similar because they have similar political structures. They had a system of representation. Ireland had a parliament that went back to the Middle Ages, and although I said earlier that Britain could intervene at any time, the odd thing is that Britain claimed the theoretical right to intervene in Irish parliamentary affairs, but was actually very cautious about the way that it intervened in Irish political affairs. And the West Indian islands all had assemblies just like the mainland colonies. Indeed, what is interesting is that their assemblies had often been more vigorous and more radical than the mainland assemblies, and also making more radical theoretical claims. The Irish Parliament, as early as 1490, had said that the British Parliament had no right to interfere in its affairs. The Assembly of Barbados in 1651, this is over, and these kinds of claims, this kind of thinking doesn't emerge in America until the 1760s. In 1651, the Assembly of Barbados said the Parliament of Britain has no right to legislate for its internal affairs. In 1692, the Irish Parliament said the British Parliament has no right to interfere with our money bills or to dictate in any way our system of taxation. One of the pamphleteers who really influenced the American patriots was an Irishman by the name of William Molineux, who back in 1692 did a pamphlet called The Case of Ireland, in which he argued for the autonomy of Ireland within the British Empire. Those ideas were expanded by Dr. Charles Lucas in the 1740s, and also by Jonathan Swift, who's perhaps better known to most of us for writing Gulliver's Travels. Now, it was, of course, more impractical for the British West Indies or British Caribbean and Ireland to rebel. The Caribbean colonies were the last in the Americas to rebel, whether it was from the French, Spanish, or British. Trinidad and Jamaica were the first colonies to get their independence. That wasn't until 1962. Cuba was the last of all of the Spanish colonies in the Americas to gain its independence. And in actual fact, there are still European colonies in the Caribbean, but they go to great lengths to avoid the term colony. But essentially, Martinique and Guadeloupe are still parts of metropolitan France. Places like Montserrat, the British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands still belong to Britain. Although it was difficult for them to rebel, what fascinated me was that they didn't even participate in the pamphlet war against Britain. There was nothing to stop someone writing a pamphlet and saying the Stamp Act was wrong or the Townshend duties were wrong. And yet, they never participated in that. It's their silence which I found curious, even in Ireland. And when I read Vincent Morley's book, I realized there was real similarity. That before 1774, these colonies had basically tried to stay out of the whole imperial debate between Britain and America. They'd stayed studiously, avoided any discussion of imperial constitutional issues, and especially where the rights of Britain ended and America began. They'd much preferred their own local issues that really had no significance outside of their colonies, and they stayed out of the debate until 1774 and 1775. That was the point at which the Continental Congress met, and it ends in April of 75 with Lexington and Concord. At that point, they couldn't but take a stance. And they do indeed try to intervene to avert the crisis. These colonies had nothing to gain from a war between Britain and America. In fact, they had everything to lose. It was going to adversely affect their economies, and it was also going to adversely affect their security. They knew it would explode into a war with Spain and France, and it would make them much more vulnerable. So they do try to intervene belatedly to persuade Britain to find a compromise with America. The British Caribbean even hired what today we'd consider a professional lobbyist to make the case to Parliament, not that Britain had no right, but that it would not be in Britain's economic interests to pursue this war. Thereafter, they were very divided, but only a minority really supported the American cause. And there were people like Sir Edward Newnham, who actually put a statue up in his house to George Washington. And this is in Ireland, and was very open in his support of Washington. In Ulster, the Presbyterians really showed support for the American cause. They reprinted Tom Paine's Common Sense. There'd been a huge migration of what often gets called here Scots-Irish, but from Northern Ireland in the 1760s. They had many kinsmen over here and showed a great deal of sympathy for the American Revolution. And yet, once fighting broke out, and especially after the Declaration of Independence, any kind of explicit support of the American Revolution started to disappear. In fact, you get petitions of loyalty coming out of a lot of these colonies. Jamaica in 1775 sent a petition clearly demonstrating its loyalty to Britain, even though a year earlier it had sent a petition showing some support for America, which had been commended by Congress and by the Assembly of Connecticut. What the leaders, and they called themselves patriots, incidentally, in Ireland and in the British West Indies, but what these people wanted was not separation from the empire, but as much autonomy as possible within the empire. Ireland had two very great local patriot leaders during this period, Henry Grattan and Henry Flood. And you have similar people in the British West Indies, like Charles Price in Jamaica and Sir John Gay Alleyne, after whom one of the great rums is named, Mount Gay, that was his estate in Barbados. They were outspoken, but only to have as much local authority and local self-control. They made it very clear that they were not denying British parliamentary authority. They did not want independence from Britain. And that view somewhat strengthens. Britain sent over a peace offer to America in 1778 called the Carlisle Peace Commission, in which they guaranteed never to tax America and to repeal all the legislation passed since the French and Indian War. And after that point, Britain was really just fighting for token recognition and authority. The point is, though, that those rights then went to the British West Indies. Those same guarantees were extended to the British West Indies. And Ireland used the war to gain a great many rights. Irish trade had been restricted in wool and linen. All of those restrictions were removed at the same time as the Carlisle Peace Commission. And at the end of the war in 1783, Britain passed the Renunciation Act in Ireland that essentially gave Ireland self-rule. Unfortunately, the only people who could vote in the system were Protestant. But that would have come the closest, that was the closest that could have been a solution to the Irish population. Certainly, hostility to the war really grew in 79 and 80. These places were beginning to really suffer economically. They were very worried about a French or Spanish invasion, but that was not the same as supporting America. Indeed, if you look at these places, their position was very similar to the position of the opposition in England. They just didn't like the war and wanted Britain to come to a peace, but they were not looking for separation.